Have you ever wondered what the ban on mixing woolen and linen was all about? Was this a standalone ban based on some scientific or pragmatic principle? Or was this part of a much broader problem, like the Nephilim problem? Stay tuned for an introductory dive into this provocative subject. Hi there, I'm Lee Brainerd. Welcome to Soothkeep and another edition of Prophecy in the Crucible. My mission is truth, the truth that God intends to convey to us through His Bible. This truth at any cost, this truth above every other consideration. Now, we are looking at the ban today on woolen and linen. In Leviticus 19:19 we read, "You shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your livestock breed with another kind. You shall not sow your field with mixed seed, nor shall a garment of mixed linen and wool come upon you." Now we're going to focus on the last line, where we read, "You shall not wear garments of mixed woolen and linen." Now there are various theories that treat this portion of Scripture as a standalone problem that's not directly related to anything else in the context, and it's not directly related to a much bigger spiritual problem. And these explanations boil down to two main approaches. The first is the scientific incompatibility of wool and linen. And typically people will give a pretty broad array of scientific evidence why we shouldn't mix woolen and linen. And this evidence varies from anything about scientific research on how they interact when you weave them together in cloth, scientific research on how they interact with their electric charges next to each other, scientific research on how they interact with light, visible light and different spectrums of light. And there's some interesting information that's that you're going to discover in all that information. The second line of argument, or the second approach, is the pragmatic incompatibility of wool and linen. And this generally approaches the subject from more of a layman's perspective and just gives their experience and observation in life about why you shouldn't mix things like wool and linen. And oftentimes they'll give arguments from mixing other things too. Now, there's a significant problem that we face when we look at these approaches to try and prove that there's an actual scientific or an actual pragmatic incompatibility between wool and linen. And that problem is the incompatibility of wool and linen is simply a myth. They do mix well. We've got centuries of textile industry experience mixing wool and linen. They actually mix together very well for many uses. So we need to step back and examine the context here. What are the two preceding bans? Well, the first one is that we're not supposed to mix one livestock kind with another livestock kind. And we're not supposed to sow a field with mixed seed, that is, two distinct species of crops together. Now, what clues are we going to discover if we actually look at these two bans in a much broader perspective from our current experience? Well, we're going to observe that these two bans on mixing species don't really square any better with a pragmatic or scientific approach than the ban on mixing woolen and linen in your clothing does. For instance, let's look at the ban on crossing animals. You don't need to tell any rancher that cattle and horses don't cross. They already know that. They don't need that in the Bible. They don't even need it in a rancher's Bible. They don't need to be warned that they're not going to meet with success if they try and go down that path. And they don't need to be warned that they're going to have some really odd consequences if they do succeed, because they're not going to succeed. That path doesn't work. So really what we're looking at here is there's the pragmatic and economic feasibility of attempting to cross different animal species is really not an issue that needs to be addressed, so it's not likely the issue that's being addressed here. Now, when we look at mixing crops in the field, we run into a similar circumstance. We don't need to tell farmers they're going to run into problems if they plant two different crops in the same field and intermix them. When one is ready to harvest, another one's not ready to harvest, and you try and harvest the one that's ready and the other one is going to get damaged or wasted. Or if they get mixed together in the harvest, now what do? If you got wheat and barley mixed in the same thing, they don't bake the same way, they don't handle the same way, they don't grind the same way. So you don't need to tell a farmer that mixing wheat and rye or barley and rye in the same field is not really a good idea. So they don't need that in the Bible, and they don't need it in a farmer's Bible. Furthermore, some plant species actually do benefit by being mixed with other plant species. Every serious gardener knows this. This is not new information. So this really isn't the focus of this passage here. It's not a focus on the economic feasibility or the pragmatic feasibility of mixing various seed in your field. The fact of the matter is, people typically drop methods and drop approaches or practices that don't work for them economically or practically. They just get naturally weeded out. You don't have to tell anyone that starting fires with water is not a good practice. You don't need to put that in the Bible. And you don't need to tell people that you don't make boats out of rocks. They figure this out pretty fast on their own, and they don't need that in the Bible. So if the bans here are not based on pragmatic or scientific practicality, then what are they based on? What's the rationale for these bans? Is there any other reason behind these bans that is going to throw light on the passage? Well, yes, there is. And that's where this subject is going to get very interesting. So let's take up the Nephilim thread, because the fact is the land of Canaan was deeply influenced by the whole Nephilim problem and the deep spiritual darkness that was associated with it. Now, the Nephilim problem manifested itself in several ways. First of all, it manifested itself in the problem itself. That is, the angel kind had mingled with mankind and produced Nephilim kind, which were able to procreate. And these were, in many regions of the Middle East, the god kings or the god rulers. But the Nephilim problem also involved the fact that the Nephilim were mingling and mixing species that shouldn't be mixed. They were mixing man with animals and coming up with things like satyrs and werewolves, and they were mixing animals with animals and coming up with chimeras and lions that had wings and horses that had wings, like Pegasus in mythology. But they also had the problem of their subjects imitating and emulating their god kings, and they did this by imitating their dress and their look. They imitated their mixing practices, and they symbolized the mixing that was behind their god kings and behind their mixing of species that their god kings engaged in. Now, some of the examples of this imitation and emulation include the fact that many tribes around the world practiced the flattening of the skull with boards to emulate the cone heads that their god kings had. And not only the god kings, but the entire ruling class and the high priests. Also, we see in many of the tribal nations around the world, we see men wearing horns to emulate the fact that their god kings and their high priests often had literal horns coming out of their heads. We see many indigenous tribes and peoples practicing the filing of the teeth to emulate the fact that their Nephilim god kings, many of them had sharp teeth. So, on top of that, we also see many tribes and nations and people practicing perverted sexual relationships to imitate the fact that their god kings had perverted sexual relationships. So on the basis of this imitation, imitating the fact that the angel kind had come down and cohabited with mankind, they were engaging in other kinds of forbidden sexual relationships. Now, the mixing of animals, the mixing of seed, and the mixing of woolen and linen in your garments falls into this same pattern of emulation and imitation. There's probably a variety of motives that were involved here. I would suspect that some of them perhaps hoped that if they mixed it with enough faith and prayer, that their animals would mate and produce some of the fantastic animals that the Nephilim had created. And I suppose that some of them actually hoped that with enough faith and magic that maybe mixing seed in the field would result in some of the fantastic plants that the Nephilim had created. But I would guess that primarily the people were really just engaging in symbolic practices that expressed their empathy with the Nephilim rebellion against God's bands and cords, against God's moral ways and his moral law. Now, God didn't want the Israelites to be imitating or emulating the practices of the heathen around them, because these practices were reflecting their worship or reverence of the god kings of the Nephilim. And the Lord didn't even want the Israelites to engage in these practices, even if they did them inadvertently or accidentally. These practices were just banned. Now, mixing woolen and linen portrays the same kind of mixing that happened if you're trying to mix animals or mix the seed in the field. This was mixing black goat's hair wool with white linen. So it's a black and white mixing. And this is the same symbology that we have come to know as yin and yang. Now, the yin and yang was originally derived from the dark dragon in the heavens, which was the planet Mars, interacting with the white dragon in the heavens, which was the planet Venus. And this symbolism, both of the Mars and Venus, and the symbolism with the yin and yang symbols, and the symbolism with mixing the white and the black in your cloth, all this symbolism was just portraying the spirit of the Nephilim movement, or the Nephilim effort, which was mixing things that shouldn't be mixed. And behind this whole thing was a rebellion against God's established ways. Now, the Nephilim spirit is really just another manifestation of what we call the Hegelian dialectic that the satanic realm uses all the time. You have a thesis, you have a synthesis, you get these two things opposed, you get people divided up, and then you come to the glorious solution, which is the synthesis. We see this all the time in the political realm. We see it in the religious realm with syncretism. And this is what we're seeing right here. We have the angel kind mixing with mankind and coming up with the Nephilim kind. And then we have the Nephilim mixing animal kind A and animal kind B and coming up with animal kind C, and mixing plant kind A and plant kind B and coming up with animal kind C, and even mixing plants and animals and man and animals. It gets all confused, but it's the mixing that they're aiming at. Once we understand that mixing things that don't mix is the Nephilim program, it is the great sign that the Nephilim are at work, and that the spiritual beings that brought the Nephilim problem into existence in the first place are at work. Once we understand this, then the current world is easier to understand, because the mixing problem is still going on Earth right now today before our very eyes. It's being forwarded by powerful supernatural beings. There's DNA manipulation going on, there's genetic modification, there's genetic engineering. And some of the goals include making super soldiers for the elite to exploit, but there's goals also that involve providing the global elite with longevity and enhanced strength and enhanced health and enhanced intelligence. But another aspect of the presence of the Nephilim spirits at work is the fascination with things like dwarves and elves and vampires and supernatural beings and witches. This is an aspect of the return of the Nephilim, because first you have to have the fascination with these supernatural beings, and then you're going to have the manifestation of the supernatural beings. And the last aspect of the Nephilim problem that's being observed today is the massive storm of sexual perversion. Wherever the curve is climbing steeply up the exponential curve for sexual perversion, at the same time that same exponential curve is climbing steeply for the other manifestations of Nephilim iniquity. They go together, because if you see one manifestation of Nephilim activity, you know the others are also at play. That's just how these things work. Now, in conclusion, I trust that you have further insight now on the meaning and the context of the ban on mixing woolen and linen in your clothing. I hope this will deepen your understanding of the Nephilim problem and help you in the spiritual warfare that we are engaged in. Because this problem is alive and well today. It's not merely something that we read about in the Bible and in ancient history. We are facing a very subtle, very sophisticated battles with the Nephilim problem right now in our day, and we need to be well armed. So eyes wide open, brain engaged, heart on fire. We'll see you next time.